So again, yeah, welcome you all to this mock lecture. My name is Markus Wien, as you can also see from the display on the Zoom meeting. I'm a history professor here at AUBG. I've been here now for 15 years. So I started in the fall semester of 2005. So in a way, I'm already one of the old guys here, you can say, actually. Yeah. By nationality, I'm from Germany. I've grown up near Munich. I also did my undergraduate studies there at the University of Munich. Then I went actually to Florence in Italy to the European University Institute there and did my PhD there. And right after that, basically, I came here to Blagoevgrad and started my job here at AUBG. So my teaching field here is European history. With regard to my research, I focus mostly on the history of Southeastern Europe, the Balkans, also Bulgaria, of course. So I do have a couple of publications in that field already. And now our mock lecture for today, the topic is the beginning of the First World War. So I'm basically going to do this like I would teach a regular class, a regular online class now, I have to say. I will do it exactly the same way as if this was a regular class. However, the difference is that our regular classes here are 80 minutes. And we just have 45 minutes for our class. So basically, I'm just gonna teach just normally, so to say, up until the 45th minute, and then we just have to stop there. Yeah. But I think that would just still give you the most authentic impression of the way I'm doing my teaching here at AUBG. All right, so yeah, the beginning of the First World War as a topic is, I would say, one of the fundamental questions and issues of European history in the 20th century. Scholars generally have called the First World War the fundamental catastrophe of the 20th century. So in other words, the First World War is in a way the cause for many of the negative developments, the wars, the catastrophes and disasters that followed afterwards. We call it the First World War also because, and this is the most kind of direct impact here, we call it the First World War because there was, as we all know, a Second World War. And that is not just a matter of the numbering, but it also expresses that the Second World War is a consequence of the First World War. So they are in a way part of the same context, part of what we also call the age of the world wars, so from 1914 until 1945, with roughly 20 years interwar period, as it is also called. The age of the world wars, or as the British historian Eric Hobsbawm has put it, Europe's 30 years war. So again, from 1914 till 45, roughly 30 years. So, and if you look at this as indeed one context of global warfare, then you can say, right, it is kind of a 30 years war. However, yeah, that is not enough basically as an analysis. The question, of course, is why did the Second World War follow the First World War? And the conclusion we draw from this is that obviously the outcomes of the First World War have in a way prepared the ground for the Second World War. And these outcomes indeed have mostly to do with the fact that they left a large number of countries, but of course, most of all, Germany as the biggest country that out of the group of countries that lost the war. So it left a large number of countries very dissatisfied and deeply bitter about the outcomes of that war. And it is certainly this dissatisfaction, this bitterness, which contributed a lot to the developments that ultimately lead to the Second World War. Of course, this was not foreseeable from the perspective of the year, let's say 1919, so the year that followed the end of the First World War. So from the perspective of the year 1919, everything that followed is of course future, and nobody can know the future. But in retrospection, of course, we can draw certain connections. But even back then, in the year 1919, several, let's say, bright-minded observers already understood that these outcomes of the war would not lead to a sustainable European peace. There was, for example, the American journalist and economist John Maynard Keynes, who actually was present also at the negotiations of the peace treaties of the war. So the Treaty of Versailles, for example, for Germany, you know, also the Treaty of Neuilly that was drafted for Bulgaria. So John Maynard Keynes was there, and he basically said, in 20 years, we will meet here again. So basically he anticipated that this new European order would be so unstable that roughly after 20 years, another major war would break out. And he was right. Yeah, it's almost like a prophecy that he made here. Now, one of the major issues at that time, this is why I'm talking about actually about the end of the war now. Because the end of the war, the conditions under which the war was ended with the peace treaties relates greatly actually to the conditions under which the war started. And the reason for this is that the end of the war, respectively, the peace treaties already provided an interpretation of the beginning of the war. The peace treaties included a clause that said Germany and its allies, and you know, the allies of Germany were, first of all, Austria-Hungary, the Habsburg Empire, Bulgaria also then from 1915 onwards, also the Ottoman Empire were allies of Germany. So Germany and its allies acknowledged that they are or were exclusively guilty for the outbreak of the war. And this is what this war guilt clause was then used as a justification for really harsh conditions that were imposed on the losing countries. So this included loss of territory. This included huge reparation payments that the losers had to make. This included also massive restrictions on the armed forces that the losing countries were allowed to have. It included restrictions on the foreign economic relations these countries were allowed to have. And all this was justified on the basis of that war guilt clause that was written into the peace treaties. And of course, therefore, the question of war guilt, who was guilty for the outbreak of the war, became a crucial question in all political discussions following the First World War. It became, therefore, also the justification for all policies that were made after the war. So in the interwar period, all these policies that went against the peace treaties. Particularly, of course, then in the 1930s, the Nazi government in Germany presented itself as the great liberator of the Germans from the peace treaty of Versailles, from the restrictions that the peace treaty had imposed on Germany. And generally, these peace treaties were taken in Germany, but also in the other losing countries, as a great humiliation and as kind of a punishment. And indeed, this was the intention behind the peace treaties. And for the first time, actually, in European history, a peace treaty really included such a moral condemnation of the loser. Up until then, peace treaties that ended wars, of course, defined who was the winner, who was the loser. And the winner would take something from the loser, territory, resources, whatever. but the winner would not say, we are the good ones and you are the evil ones. So a moral condemnation was usually not part of any peace settlement. So here, for the first time, we see this here. And of course, the result was that in countries like Germany, but also the other losing countries, a whole industry, so to say, occurred now that had only one purpose, and that was to prove that Germany and its allies were not guilty for the outbreak of the war. Now the question, and this of course is was a predominant issue that was discussed in the interwar period, but even after the Second World War, this discussion did not stop. Even after the war, this went on, again, still in Germany, but also in other losing countries. And what is interesting also is that this a whole debate of who was guilty of for the outbreak of the war, even then, reoccurred on the European agenda then in the year 2014, so only 6 years ago, in the year 2014, when Europe commemorated 100 years since the outbreak of the First World War. A book that was published exactly in that year triggered the discussion and put more, let's say, fuel to it. And this was the book Sleepwalkers by the Australian historian Christopher Clark. This is a book that had a great impact on the debates in Germany, but for example, also in Serbia. And Christopher Clark, an Australian historian, so you could think, well, he doesn't really have any stakes in this. He is unbiased as an Australian. He very clearly said that basically all European countries that got involved in the First World War have made their contribution to its outbreak. So you cannot exclusively blame the outbreak of the war just on the losing countries. This is something that was, of course, in a sense, taken with great interest, of course, in Germany, and also with a little bit of a relief. So in other words, many Germans, of course, were in a sense grateful for this view that they cannot be blamed for everything, for all the bad things that happened in the 20th century. Of course, the Germans are taking the blame and have to take the blame for the Second World War and what happened during that war. But maybe not so exclusively and so directly for what for the First World War. So, of course, there was kind of a positive reception of that book in Germany, while the reception, for example, in Serbia was very negative, because Clark actually indeed put a great blame on Serbia and actually saying, well, that in 1914, Serbia had been conducting a policy of provoking a war for roughly, well, 10, 15 years, actually. So in other words, Serbian nationalism had been very, very aggressive against particularly the Habsburg Empire, which was in its direct neighborhood. And this again started the discussion all over. So you see that even 100 years after the beginning of the First World War, it is still possible to stir up controversies, even emotions, national emotions as well. And this makes it really into, definitely one of the fundamental questions in European history. Now, and therefore, I think it does make sense to look at the conditions under which the First World War began. And of course, this requires us to raise the question, how do we define that question of war guilt? Who is it actually? Who is guilty of the outbreak of the war? By which criteria do we make a judgment of who is guilty of the outbreak of the war? So I would now, throw out that question to you, to my audience here. What are the questions you would try to find an answer to? So in order to find out who is guilty of the war. So what are the criteria? Any suggestions? You can unmute yourself if you want to say something. And I'm waiting for suggestions. So how do you define who is guilty for the outbreak of the war? Georgi, yes?
In my opinion, the guilty ones are we, the humans, the people.
The people, right? Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
This is, of course, a very, let's say, the broadest possible answer.
Yes, I know.
And of course, it is true that, I mean, war is something man-made, and therefore it is people who make also the decisions. From that viewpoint, definitely it is a human guilt, so to say. Yeah.
Yes.
But if you look at the different countries and now try to find out, well, was it Germany? Was it Serbia? Was it Austria? Was it Russia or France? How would you address that? How would you approach that question? By looking at what?
Well, maybe by looking at directions, which country has gotten a bit far than the others. I mean,
maybe, yeah. So indeed, yeah. Tony, yeah, you want to say something?
Yeah, in my opinion, probably the most guilty ones are the countries that cause the most harm to the others and other people.
All right. Yeah, so that is indeed, that would be a possible way to approach it. So who caused more harm, more damage to the others? Yeah. But that is, of course, something that happens while the war has already started. So, but if we ask who is guilty for the beginning, for the outbreak of the war, we need to probably also look at some other questions. So, of course, you can say, well, the ones who are guilty are those who fired the first shot, who started the hostilities, who started the shooting. That's a way of approaching it. You can, of course, also say, well, those are guilty who have drafted and signed the war declarations. At that time, it was still common practice that before the actual hostilities start, a country would declare war on another one. So in other words, a written declaration of war would be handed over from one government to the other through the embassy of that respective country in the other country. Yeah? But of course, that would mean actually we're looking really just at the very moment in history when the war begins. We could probably say, all right, we could maybe say, well, let's look at some of the historical developments that happened before. Yeah? So maybe the ground for the war was prepared maybe in the 10 years before the war. Yeah? So you can say, right, yeah, maybe Germany has conducted a very aggressive foreign policy in the 10, 15 years before the outbreak of the war. Therefore, Germany is guilty. Yeah. Germany has also declared war on Russia and France, for example. Therefore, also Germany is guilty, respectively Austria-Hungary is guilty because they had declared war on Serbia. Right, so these are possible ways to approach it. The problem with these long-term explanations is, to me, that it's very hard to discuss this in terms of guilt, because again, it is impossible to predict the future, and you can never know what long-term consequences something has that you do in this very moment. So if you say, okay, from that viewpoint, you could say, well, the winning countries of the First World War are in a way also guilty for the Second World War. But as I said, this is a very problematic approach, I would say. But something else that you could, of course, look at is the question maybe, what about war planning? Which countries did have, in a way, ready war plans? So from these plans, you could say, right, yeah, we can draw the conclusion that they had an intention to start a war, maybe not in that particular moment, but in the next possible moment or so. Yeah. So that is a question you could look at. And finally, you can, of course, also look at the question that is relevant then indeed during the war. So the amount of damage that a country causes to others. But another question, of course, is maybe the question of, well, did a country that participated in the war end the war when there was an opportunity to do that, or did it not? Did a country carry on with the war even though there was an opportunity to stop it? And that is, of course, also another question. For example, in the year 1916, so in the middle of the First World War, a number of peace initiatives were taken. But usually rejected by the respective other side. So here there was maybe an opportunity to stop the war, but it wasn't stopped. The belligerent powers preferred to continue fighting. And that is also, I would say, a matter of war guilt. So it's not only about starting the war, it's of course also about ending the war. How and when was it ended? Were there opportunities to end it earlier, actually? Right, yeah, so there are a number of criteria by which we can discuss how, under which circumstances the war actually started, and how justified, let's say, the idea was to blame it all on Germany and its allies. To blame it all on Germany and its allies, and therefore consequently then impose harsh measures on Germany and its allies in the peace treaties. Right, yeah, so, but first I would really like to look at the conditions, the circumstances rather, under which the war broke out. I will now do a screen sharing. I will start that now to put a PowerPoint slideshow on the screen for you on your displays, which I would also normally use in my regular classes at AUBG. So the First World War, I will also start the slideshow now so that you can see this really full screen. So the First World War and its outbreak, of course, here we see the concrete circumstances which do not really tell extremely much about the question of war guilt. Just a moment, I have to arrange my display a little bit here. So the immediate circumstances on the eve of the war, of course, are all connected somehow with this famous incident that happened on the 28th of June 1914, and that is the assassination of the Austrian Crown Prince, Franz Ferdinand or Francis Ferdinand. Does anybody know who assassinated him? Yes, a Serbian. Do you by chance know his name?
No, just his nationality.
No. Okay, yeah, so his name was Gavrilo Princip. He was a Serbian nationalist. He shot both Crown Prince Francis Ferdinand and his wife while they were on a visit to Sarajevo on that 28th of June 1914. And this basically he was not directly linked to the Serbian government, but he was a member of an organization called the Black Hand. And this organization was a Serbian nationalist terror organization. A terror organization, however, which received a lot of support, financial, logistical support, mainly by the Serbian government. So the Austrian government was not entirely wrong when they actually blamed the assassination, at least indirectly, on the Serbian government. The reason why Serbian nationalists were actually active in Bosnia-Herzegovina was so that Bosnia-Herzegovina was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, but the Serbs actually claimed it as Serbian land. In their eyes, the population of Bosnia-Herzegovina was ethnically Serbian, and therefore they, according to their understanding, Bosnia-Herzegovina was actually supposed to belong to Serbia. However, in 1878, after the Russian-Turkish War, Austria-Hungary had actually occupied Bosnia-Herzegovina in order to indeed keep it under control and not let Serbian nationalism grow too far. Yeah. So from 1878 onwards, this land, Bosnia-Herzegovina, was under Serbian occupation. It was then in 1908 formally annexed by Austria-Hungary. So Serbian nationalists were, of course, furious about that. And the Black Hand indeed developed a very, let's say, permanent terror activity in Bosnia-Herzegovina, basically since, at latest, since the beginning of the 20th century. And indeed, the culmination of that development is then the assassination of the Austrian crown prince, which the Austrian government blames on the Serbian government, at least indirectly. So basically they say, well, they told the Serbian government then, well, okay, now it is up to you to prove that you have nothing to do with this. And for that, you will allow Austrian criminal investigators, Austrian police, to start investigations on Serbian territory, investigations against the Black Hand. And this was communicated to Serbia as an ultimatum, which Serbia rejected. The ultimatum was connected with the concrete threat of starting a war. So Serbia knew when they rejected the ultimatum that this could actually result in a war against Austria-Hungary, but Serbia had the full support by the Russian government. So that Serbia was actually not that afraid of engaging in a war with Austria-Hungary because they knew they would get help from Russia. And from that viewpoint, of course, here we already have such a point, we can actually say that both Serbia and also Russia, in a way, willingly provoked an Austrian declaration of war. This declaration of war followed then on the 28th of July. Yeah? And of course, Austria declared war on Serbia. So we cannot say that Austria is innocent. The country that declares war certainly also contributes to the outbreak of the war. Whether this declaration was provoked or not, it is there. And ultimately, the Austrian government could have decided not to declare war on Serbia. But it did, so there was the war, and very quickly the war then escalated to a larger European and ultimately also global war. Because, yeah, with this war that was now going on already between Austria on the one hand, Austria-Hungary, I have to say to be more correct, on the one hand, and Serbia and Russia on the other hand, Germany basically then, of course, did not want to risk a situation in which the Austrian-Hungarian Empire would ultimately collapse. So they declared war on Russia and also on France at the beginning of August 1914. Now, this declaration of war from the German side on Russia and France indeed did have the purpose to support Austria-Hungary, but it also was again more or less directly provoked by, particularly by the Russians, because 2 weeks before, the Russian government had actually ordered the general mobilization of its armed forces and dislocated the Russian armed forces next to the German eastern border. And yeah, now if you put yourself into the shoes of the German government back then, what is your interpretation of such a step? You have a massive army that appears next to your eastern border. What does that mean if not an intention to start a war? So Germany, the German government basically was now basically assuming that a war against Russia was inevitable. And since France was an ally of Russia, this war would also mean automatically a war against France. So the German government decided, well, before they take the initiative, it's better we take the initiative. So they declared war on Russia and France in August 1914. but for tactical reasons, Germany takes the initiative in the West. These reasons have to do with the German assumption that the Russian army was not very quick in acting, was also badly organized and led by its officers, while the French army was viewed as one of the most modern and efficient armies in Europe. So the Germans basically believed that it's better first to act against France, to remain passive on the Eastern Front against Russia. Yeah. And so to act against France first, and then after an anticipated victory against France, Germany would then act against Russia. So that is basically the chain reaction that starts the First World War. So the Austrian declaration of war basically triggered a chain reaction that activated the existing alliance systems in Europe. Germany and Austria were allies, the so-called Central Powers, while Russia, France, and Britain were members of the so-called Triple Entente, the Triple Entente, so a military alliance between these three countries. However, Britain actually in the very beginning of the war stayed outside of the war, but declared that if Germany would act against Belgium, then it would also declare war on Germany. The British, of course, knew that Germany would have to act against Belgium because they would have to march through Belgian territory in order to take a quick, strike against Paris. That was the German plan because they believed that the French troops that were dislocated directly at the French-German border would be too strong. So basically they tried to circumvene them by marching through Belgium. And that is what ultimately brought brought Britain also into the war. This basically is the chain reaction that brought the European great powers into the war. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, France, and Britain. While the other smaller powers in Europe kind of engaged or entered the war a little bit later, mostly as a result of tactical considerations. So the Ottoman Empire, for example, or in other words, Turkey, got into the war in a way to, out of the motivation to keep the Russians away from controlling the Black Sea. So they, in a way, also provoked a Russian declaration of war against the Ottoman Empire as a reaction to the Turkish provocations. But that was, of course, something that was also very much in the interest of Germany, because Germany knew now that Russia would have to fight also on two fronts, so against Germany and also against the Ottoman Empire. Italy joins the Entente powers in the winter 1915-16. So going against Austria and Germany after the Entente powers, so particularly Britain and France, have made Italy promises. So if you join the war on our side, you will get this and that if we win the war. And this and that were mainly territories that Italy would take from the Habsburg Empire at the end of the war. That was the idea. So Italy would expand its territory northwards to the Alps, to make the Alps ultimately its northern border. And it would also take Dalmatia and Croatia from the Habsburg Empire in order to control entirely the Adriatic Sea. Bulgaria joins the Central Powers in 1915, hoping to ultimately realize its national aspiration, and that is the annexation of Macedonia. So since Macedonia until the First World War had belonged to Serbia, so since the Balkan Wars had actually belonged to Serbia, of course, Bulgaria naturally would have to join the enemies of Serbia in order to fulfill this national aspiration, the annexation of Macedonia. This is why Bulgaria joins the Central Powers in 1915. While Romania is in the opposite situation, Romania has national territorial aspirations for Transylvania, which belonged to the Habsburg Empire. So in 1916, Romania declares war on Austria, joins the Entente powers after it had been neutral for 2 years in the war. Ultimately, Greece joins the Entente in 1917, hoping that it could make massive territorial gains on the expenses of the Ottoman Empire. So when we look at this, basically, ultimately, we have almost the entire European continent involved in that First World War. And it is hard to say that indeed one country or one group of countries is exclusively responsible for the outbreak of the war. This is, I think, something that is evident from looking at these at the circumstances under which the war broke out. The circumstances, I think, demonstrate that each of the belligerent countries could have done more than it actually did to prevent the war or to stay outside of the war. Or on the other hand, none of the countries really did have a material, substantial reason to engage in that war. The lack of reasons is something that is also quite evident, I would say, when we look at the war goals that the different countries had. What is very significant and interesting in this context, I find, is the fact that none of the European great powers had actually clearly defined war goals. In other words, they started a war without really knowing what they were fighting for. It was simply a situation which had escalated into a war, and which obviously was a war that nobody really had anticipated and planned, at least not at that point in time and not in the shape that it actually took. This is also why Christopher Clark's book is called Sleepwalkers. So his hypothesis is that the European great powers, just like sleepwalkers, stumbled into that war without really deliberately planning it and deliberately defining their war goals. The evidence for the fact that nobody really had clearly defined war goals lies in the fact that actually the discussions of what the war goals were really started in the belligerent countries during the war. Ultimately, they all kind of found some goals that would ultimately justify their engagement in the war, but these were indeed war goals that they defined after the war had already started. So Britain, for example, wanted to have the colonies that Germany had at that time in Africa and also the Southern Pacific. Britain wanted to have large parts of the Ottoman Empire in order to consolidate its position, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean Hemisphere and North Africa. France wanted to gain German territories on the west of the River Rhine. Russia wanted to have access to the Mediterranean Sea. So in other words, they indeed wanted to control the Black Sea and particularly also the straits that connected the Black Sea with the Mediterranean Sea. And Germany developed plans to develop a larger economic sphere in Central Europe, Mitteleuropa as they called it, which would include also Belgium, but particularly also the countries of East Central Europe, countries which did not exist at that time as independent countries, but they expected that the Russian Empire would fall apart and there would be newly independent small countries in East Central Europe, such as Poland, the Baltic countries, Finland or so, which would then be economically dependent on Germany, so that Germany would build up a larger economic or informal economic empire in East Central Europe. So, and this, the fact that these war goals were discussed while the war had already started. The fact that none of these concepts were really very well thought through. All this tells us that the countries, none of the belligerent countries, really were actually prepared for a war, at least not in July, August 1914. So nobody really had actually a clear intention to go for war. They, in a way, took the war as something that appeared to them as something inevitable. So basically, okay, now we have a situation where a war seems to be inevitable, so let's start it and get it behind. Most governments believe that the war would actually be over by Christmas 1914. We all know that it lasted for more than 4 years. But again, this highlights very strongly, I would say, how difficult it is really to blame it all on one country and its allies. So Germany, of course, and its allies. Of course, countries, Germany and its allies. So these allies, of course, were all relatively small or not really extremely strong, maybe with the exception of Austria-Hungary. So, of course, for them, the blame is even smaller. But generally, the group of the so-called Central Powers, including also the Ottoman Empire in Bulgaria, I would also agree, cannot be exclusively blamed for the outbreak of the war. And taking this into consideration maybe could have led to a little bit of a milder peace and milder peace treaties than in 1918, 1919. And we do not know, of course, whether this would have led to a different development in Europe in the interwar period and the Second World War. All right, so far we're through with time. This is normally not the end of the lecture. I would carry on a little bit also with more details as of the military developments and so on and so forth. But other than that, this is I would say a significant example of my teaching style here at AUBG. I will now stop the screen sharing. Of course, if you have any questions, I'll be here. You can still ask me questions. Do you have any questions at this point? Anybody? No. Okay, fine. Yeah, Georgi? Yeah?
Not at this point, no.
No?
I don't.
Okay, fine. All right. Yeah, well, okay, great. I'm happy you joined me. This is really great. I hope you got a fair impression, a realistic impression now of how I do my teaching. Of course, I have to say how I do my online teaching. At this point, I can unfortunately not really demonstrate to you how we teach in the classroom, but this is the reality we have to live with at this point in time. So of course, you can of course also contact me later. I'm pretty sure the admissions office at AUBG will be happy to give you my email address. So if you have any further questions, this is not the last opportunity now to ask me questions. You can get back to me at any time. And I would really be happy if I could meet you all at some point here on campus at AUBG. All right, well, again, thank you very much for joining. I hope this was informative for you. I will now end the session. And I will be happy if I would see you at some point and if I would hear from you at some point again in the future. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.